How do you create the best training program for you? You hear it all the time. Everyone is different. You have to figure out what works for you. You can't just copy somebody else's program. That's true, but it's true on a spectrum. I want to break down when you actually need to customize your training, when you can rely on a pre-made program, and what it truly means to individualize your workouts. Because individualized training is often misunderstood. First, we need to define what it means to individualize your training. For the sake of this discussion, this means individualizing your training volumes, exercise selection, intensity, and when to shift your training focus, based on how you respond. And just as importantly, what it isn't. Individualization does not mean grabbing pieces from 5 different programs that you like and mashing them together. It's not random or emotional or based on what you enjoy the most. It's a process. It's starting from something reasonable and then refining it through observation and feedback. Before you can individualize anything, you have to understand what a reasonable program looks like. There is no best training program. There are reasonable starting points. That distinction is critical. Customizing a program is not about inventing something new from scratch. It's about starting with something solid and then making thoughtful adjustments as you learn and adapt. We have an entire playlist breaking down how to build a training program from the ground up. I outline good starting points, progression principles, and core programming concepts. Because you can't optimize a program if you don't understand what actually goes into making a good program in general. All successful programs work with key biological truths. We need consistent increasing overload to drive adaptation, recovery and adaptation capacity is limited, and specificity drives the adaptations you need to train for. These principles, though, can look very different in application. Many different styles of training have helped athletes become elite across many sports. All this is to say, one guy's system isn't necessarily better than another, given both have a proven history and similar success. They're just differing ways to utilize these principles and handle trade-offs. So if you find a training methodology you like, makes sense to you, and is proven effective, go ahead and start with that. From there, you can apply the following process to slowly mold that program into what's right for you. I keep mentioning a process, or slowly molding the program. If it were easy or straightforward, the concept of creating an individual program wouldn't make sense. The complexity is in the fact we actually are different, so I can't tell you how many sets or what exercises to do on which days. Our biology, though, is similar enough that we can get a pretty decent estimate based on what the vast majority of coaches use for certain goals. We aren't so different that a solid, well-made program isn't going to work well for you. However, we aren't discussing something working well, but trying to squeeze out the last few percentage points to help you get to that next level. When I say a reasonable program, we're looking at rough guidelines for starting points and progression models. If I said to you, go squat 20 hard sets next session, and we're going to progress by adding 10 pounds every week, that's not very sustainable. If I said do 1 set of 5 in the squat just sometime next week, well, that's likely a low enough volume that more would be better. Something like 4 sets of 5, or 3 sets of 8, or 5 sets of 5 done twice per week is a much more reasonable starting point. At the start, the differences between those options are non-existent. Then, the hard part isn't finding some magic answer, but in being consistent, focusing, and giving high effort for years. That's what really drives progress. As you train hard and be consistent following a reasonable program, you will learn things that allow you to adapt and change that program to your needs. You can't say, well, I think my program isn't good for me when you miss half the sessions, don't pay attention to how you feel during or after training, or just don't give high effort. With that said, how do you decide how much training volume to do? Because we can all agree that there's a level of training that's so little you won't improve, and there's a level that's so much that you're not going to recover or get hurt. Somewhere in between is a productive range. You might have heard of minimum effective volume, or the least amount of volume you can do to make progress, or maximal adaptive volume, or the volume that is maximally productive at that point in time. Maximal recoverable volume, or the most volume that you can do while still making some progress. These terms were popularized by Dr. Mike Israetel. While I think some of the systems around finding these exact numbers can become overly complex, the core idea makes sense. There are ranges of productive training, and those ranges differ between individuals, between phases, and even within the same person over time. So how do you actually apply this? Assuming you are training hard, between an 8 and 10 out of 10 effort each set, I have a pretty simple rule. If you're training to build muscle or general work capacity, add a single set if you're recovering fully before the next session. meaning soreness has subsided, performance feels strong, you feel prepared and not drained. If you're squatting 4 sets of 8 and feel completely fresh next session, experiment with 5 sets of 8. Then observe. Strength and speed training are slightly different. Where hypertrophy tolerates fatigue, strength and speed rely heavily on the nervous system's quality. If you are in a high volume training phase and transition into more strength work, reduce sets to roughly 70% your previous volume, at least to start. Focus on increasing load, improving speed, maintaining crisp technique. If your 5th set of 3 is consistently ugly, technique breaks down, reps slow dramatically, you just feel neurologically drained, that's a signal, not of weakness, but of nervous system fatigue. The same applies to sprinting. If times begin to drop significantly, the quality of stimulus is gone. Strength and speed training should feel sharp, not exhausting. You can experiment with adding sets. However, more often than not, if the work is easy enough to add sets, given a reasonable range, adding intensity would be better. For strength, that means increasing the weight. For speed, that means more time spent at top speed. Progressing from 5 times 40 meter sprints to 5 times 50 meter sprints allows for more time spent in and around top speed, where another set at 40 meters would just increase the time accelerating and not be as potent a stimulus. Just make sure over time you avoid the ego problem. As you get stronger and faster, you will fatigue quicker. 5 sets of 3 at 200 pounds isn't the same as 5 sets of 3 at 600 pounds. As intensity increases, sustainable volume often decreases. Look for signs of fatigue and consistent performance decrease later in sets. If that is consistently occurring and your recovery work, nutrition, and sleep are on point, you might want to experiment with dropping a set. Aim to train for optimal progress, not just to match your old volume marks when it no longer applies. That will separate you at the highest levels. Choosing exercises follows the same logic. If an exercise allows for consistent overload, doesn't create unnecessary joint irritation, and supports your goals, it's a good choice. And introduce new movements slowly. Keep them in for at least 6 weeks before evaluating. You need enough time to see how your body actually responds. For example, if you've always flat benched but want to incline or do weighted push-ups, keep the flat bench in at least once per week. Introduce the new movement gradually and monitor the response. There's no rule that says you must bench press for your horizontal pushing. Have 2 to 4 options per movement pattern, and you can rotate through them. And this doesn't need to be an even split. You can bench mostly, but then say switch to weighted push-ups every now and then, just for a slight change. Just don't make the assumption immediately that you are uniquely different from the rest of humanity when picking exercises. Start with movements that have decades of successful application. Back squats, pull-ups, bench pressing, basic sprint work, and other common, highly effective movements. Then refine for your best fit. Now that we have volume and exercise selection, when you switch training focus depends mostly on your goals and your body's ability to handle that training. For example, how do you know when to switch from more strength work to more speed training? Well, if you're a soccer player, likely speed training is more important, so you're going to spend proportionally more of your time there. The same thing if you're an offensive lineman, you're going to proportionally need more strength training. Then, within that same person or sport, maybe you're just very weak as a soccer player, and at least for maybe one off season, you need a higher percentage of training focused on strength work, just to build up your base. The same thing for an offensive lineman who's maybe very strong, but lacks some of that speed, quickness, and explosiveness. They might want to spend some more time there. To determine the rough proportions of time spent on certain qualities, we look to both the specific sport and the individual athlete's needs. You may also find that you can only handle so much of one type of training before needing a deload week. I know with my training, I can usually go 5 hard progressing weeks of training before I need a deload. Occasionally, I can stretch it to 6 or compress it to 4 if the timing lines up. For example, with a vacation or a very busy week. But I don't plan on a normal training block going 8 weeks. For you, it might be 4 weeks, or some 8. A general rule of thumb is the bigger and stronger you are, the less time you can train hard with no rest. A young junior high beginner doesn't even need deload week in their vocabulary. If the program is reasonably started and progressed, they can train for months before needing a break. And often that is just for psychological reasons more so than their bodies can't handle it. I also know I can't train heavy all the time. If I'm benching and say doing heavy sets of pull-ups for sets of 3, my shoulders, wrists, and elbows will start hurting if I try doing that more than 2 or 3 training blocks. When doing my heaviest benching, I can also only sustain 1 really heavy day per week. The other day, I usually use some form of speed and power training to give the nervous system a stimulus without trashing my shoulders and wrists. These are things that will never be in any program you pick up online. You have to train for a while, in a reasonable manner, and pay attention, make small adjustments, and then observe the response. Now you might be thinking, that takes a lot of work. Well, yes and no. Because first off, you should already understand what a solid program looks like and be training hard consistently. Then it's just about paying attention to how certain things feel and experimenting with maybe 1 or 2 changes at a time. If you change too much or too quickly, then you're not going to know why things are happening and how you respond to which thing. Secondly, I would say this is only needed at a very high level. If you are looking to train for health, or just to be strong and maybe do well in your sport, you can likely just follow a pre-made program. I mean, still pay attention to some of this, like don't keep benching if you hate it, just swap it out for a similar movement you like better. However, if you're looking to train at the top of your sport or coach athletes at the highest level, even a small increase in performance from tailoring the program to the athlete can be huge. Less than 2/100ths of a second separated gold from bronze in the 2024 100-meter Olympic final. It was so close that Fred Curley's foot crossed the finish line first and he took the bronze, because in track the torso is what determines placement. At those levels, the difference between following a well-made training plan and one that is tailor-built to you is the difference between Olympic gold and just missing the podium. For athletes and coaches at the highest level, there isn't an already made perfect program or system you can download in a PDF and use forever. Training at that level requires thinking, observation, and adjustment as you go. Take this information along with our general programming videos to start at a reasonable place and adjust it to you. If you have any specific questions, please drop them in the comments. Good luck, and never stop improving.